Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Scrubbing the Skies, Carbon Dioxide Removal and its Role in Addressing Climate Change. As always, I'm your host, Will Burns, and I serve as the co-director of the Institute. Well, last year was assuredly a kinetic one in the field of carbon dioxide removal, right? Investments spiked substantially, but there was also a growing concern that demand may not be sufficiently robust in this decade and in ensuing ones to help facilitate the scaling of carbon dioxide removal to a level that can make a meaningful contribution to addressing climate change. And of course, there was also roiling of the voluntary carbon markets, largely focused on the integrity of carbon offset approaches with a particular concern about avoided deforestation credits. So the question is what to do to facilitate markets, to ensure high integrity, to scale up to the levels that are necessary in the timeframes that are pertinent to avoiding passing critical climatic thresholds. Well, today's speaker, Phil Boyd, is the lead author of a new article in the journal Nature that sets forth a four-stage plan to address these issues. Dr. Boyd is a professor of marine science, ecology, and biodiversity at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies at the University of Tasmania in Hobart, Tasmania, Australia. And the article's title is Developing a Market for Carbon Removal Offsets that is Fit for Purpose. Welcome, Philip.
Thanks, Will.
So, as usual, we'll begin with an initial intervention by our speaker, followed by a few questions by me to seed the conversation, and then followed by audience questions. So, as always, I strongly encourage everyone to begin populating the Q&A box with your questions during the presentation, so we'll get a sense of how many questions we need to field and get to as many of them as possible. And so with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Philip.
Thanks, Will. Thank you. And the first thing I got to do is get something off my chest, and that is, why is an ocean scientist in Australia pontificating to this audience about markets for carbon removal offsets? And to do that, I've got this slide here from a recent paper. And really, the reason we have to do this is because around the globe, many smart folks are devising, developing, and testing a whole range of different methods for CDR. And as you can see from this figure here, we have a sort of a timeline, which, as you'll see later on, we reckon is about a decade. And so it would be very, I think, disappointing for those people putting all those efforts into different methods and their development to find that we didn't have a suitable market for CDR offsets, which, as Will mentioned, is needed to really be the economic driver of this. And so in the same way, we have to parallel process other challenges like adaptive governance, the development of social license, techno-infrastructure. I'm suggesting that we also then have to have a look, and we have to participate in looking at the market for CDR offsets, because potentially for those of us interested in CDR, we potentially may be the catalyst for the supply of carbon dioxide removal offsets. And just to illustrate this, here's a very useful slide from Carbon 180. But as we see, with key challenges for ocean carbon removal, they focus on governance, on knowledge, on monitoring, reporting, and verification. But there's no mention of the markets. Maybe just there wasn't room to cover it. But it also could be that we're not really thinking that the markets are our responsibility. Whereas I think that we, as potential suppliers of CDR, have a key interactive role to play in this. And so the catalyst for this work goes back to January 21. This was a document, 100 or so pages, that was initiated by Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England. He was the special envoy for climate for the UK COP26. And this task force comprises a bunch of folks who really are being the market, the buyers and sellers of carbon offsets and standard setters. And then they also were surrounded by a wider sort of consultation group. So I read this with great interest, and I'll be delving into it and picking up on a couple of points which I think are important. So this is from the preface, and again, as I tried to get across in my opening slide, and it's highlighted here on the left, we need to get going on this now. We can't wait. This needs to be set up in place, and part of the reason for that is that we kind of left things a little bit too late. We can see from this other figure here, we can see that had we started mitigation 20 years ago, we would require about a 4% CO2 mitigation, because now we've left in 2019, that's about 18%. So that's a massive decarbonization with major socio-political and economic issues. And so hence, we really have to start to do some of the negative emissions, the actual pulling carbon out of the atmosphere that were talked about at the COP in Paris. And so the two articles I'll be drawing material from today are two that we put out last year. My co-authors are part of a virtual climate recovery institute that we have here in Australia. So some of them are ocean scientists. Richard is an economist. And then we followed this up with a slightly simpler article then in the conversation that Chris Turney led. But really, these were our responses as people interested in potentially supplying carbon dioxide removal offsets to the market sort of task force. And again, going back to the preface in terms of the rationale, to facilitate this global decarbonization, there's a need for a large carbon market, one that promotes genuine action of high environmental integrity. That really, amen to that. That really had me nodding my head in terms of what we need to do in terms of developing a market, and great to see this coming then from the market itself. They had an 8-point roadmap, which is too difficult to blow up. The font's too small, but the two I'll focus on in the talk today are credit level integrity and then demand and supply engines. So the first one really deals with getting some more texture into the carbon market, core carbon principles, and then this taxonomy of additional attributes. And the second one is really about the upscaling that Will mentioned in the preamble to this talk, scaling up of a high integrity supply. So let's have a look at both of these. And really, what they want to do here then is bring these additional attributes or characteristics that can be used to classify projects, credits, offsets. And they mentioned some things: the vintage, the project type, the co-benefits, the location, and so forth and so on. And the rationale for doing that is to give buyers additional choices in the contracts they build. So by adding some texture into the offset market, by bringing these additional attributes, we introduce more choice for buyers and more options. And I'll come back to this later, because I think this is the key linchpin that links the demand and the supply in terms of carbon removal offsets. If we go then to scaling up and high integrity supply, this is where they start to link then the removal of gigatons or billion tons of carbon with how much money the market could be. So by 2030, between 5 to 30 to possibly up to 50 billion. And with that growing further, you can see in this article from The Economist last year, they're talking about $1 trillion business by 2050. So with that amount of money, it really is important that we get this right and do have a market that's fit for purpose. However, the task force did come up with a number of potential speed bumps. So at the moment, the offset market and the voluntary markets is dominated by avoidance offsets. So here in Australia, the main avoidance offsets are avoiding clearing vegetation from land or from deforestation. And that presents two problems, which I'll step you through. The first is that with the increased demand projected by the task force by businesses wanting to build in net zero options into their their carbon or their climate planning, they reckon there'll be a 15-fold increase in demand by 2030, and that may increase by up to 50-fold by 2050. So where are we going to get these carbon offsets from? Because clearly, there's only so much land clearing we can avoid, and there's only so much deforestation we can avoid, because we're looking to grow this into a billion-ton, multiple billion-ton industry. And so there's clearly not going to be enough. The second thing is that avoidance credits don't actually do anything for us for our CO2 mitigation curve. Granted, they don't make things worse. They don't exacerbate things by releasing more emissions into the atmosphere, but they don't do the removal, and we need removal at scale. That's come out from 3 IPCC reports. So that's the first issue. The other issue then is, how quickly can we ramp up the supply of carbon removal credits, that have to be of a high integrity supply? How soon can we do that? And so in this first part of the talk, I'm going to actually step through how long it might take us to spin up carbon removal credits to meet this. So the first thing to look at then is from the IPCC 22 Working Group 3 report, and you can see here that in addition to saying that CDR is a necessary element to achieve net zero, they also talk about a range of different attributes in methods: timescale, technological maturity, mitigation, potential cost, co-benefits. So again, that starts to mesh with this idea of attributes that the market's demanding. More on that later. But first of all, as you can see here from the current Carbon Herald annual report, we're really at the start of the journey, and that's very well illustrated by this article by Jeff Tollefson in Nature last year. We can see this is the scale bar we're looking at the minute. This is ocean alkalinity enhancement work that's being done in New York State, but we really are at the start of the journey, and so we need to work out then how long it's going to take us to get up to the delivery at scale. And one way we can do that is to use the technical readiness level scale that was developed by NASA. We see here TRL 1 is really just a light bulb moment, the preliminary idea. And then we have 9 levels to step through before we can actually deliver a commercial product. So the last IPCC report from 2022, they actually took a stab at seeing what the status of most of these TRLs were. And we can see most of them are very early days. This is ocean alkalinity enhancement. I showed you in the last slide. It's at sort of 1 to 2. Same with ocean fertilization. Some of the things like bioenergy, carbon capture and storage are sort of at 5 to 6. But again, they still have some ways to go. So how long is that going to take? Well, here's an example from a Dutch guy called Boyan Slat, who's got a great website where you can really look at the evolution of this technology to clean up the Great Pacific garbage patch. You can see here with this large sort of trawl net mopping up the plastic. But when you look at their website, it took over a decade to get from that initial technical readiness level to where they're at out on the ocean at the minute. And so I think that's quite a useful and sort of a practical scale bar to be using. So a decade. And so we had this sort of chicken and egg situation, because it's going to take up a decade, maybe up to a decade, to spin these things up. But at the same time, the quicker we can do that, the quicker then that the key role that the markets play in terms of scaling down cost curves for emerging technologies can be put into place. So we somehow have to try and strike a balance between developing the market and then tapping into the market's ability then to get these technologies out there earlier. That's an issue maybe we can discuss towards the end of this event. So moving on to the second part of the presentation, then we've talked about the issue of timescales and the mismatch for supply and demand, but is the market itself fit for purpose? The key sort of angle in the talk. So we can go to a bunch of websites. This one's carboncredits.com. And here I've just seeded it with a couple of quotes from some of our publications. But you can see there we have both mandatory and compliance markets here. I won't go into those in detail, but I will give you a link to a useful website if you want to find out more about those. But again, we have a wide range of different prices. The voluntary market mainly down less than $10 US per ton. Some of these other nature-based ones are around about $100 a ton. So we have a lot of pricing, different pricing out there. The key thing with any of those prices is that they are much less than the expense of actually removing a ton of carbon dioxide. So the current market value scales anywhere from a couple of bucks up to 100. The actual cost, this is actually a conservative estimate from our paper, but it's at least $200 per ton. Some are considerably more than that there. And one of the issues is that this particularly low market price, we think, is in part a legacy of the current reliance on avoidance credits, because essentially all you have to do is say, I will not clear my land, and you get credits for it, or I will not cut down my stand of trees, and you get credit for it. You don't actually have to do anything. You don't have to invest in any technology. You have to do some monitoring, reporting, and verification, but essentially it's a much lower cost to implement in comparison to removal offsets. And here we can see with a wide range of different removal offsets, they're all very different in terms of how mature they are, how scalable they are, how effective they are, and also with the costs involved. So again, we have a mismatch between the current market prices and the actual costs that are involved in developing these technologies, which require much more R&D than avoidance offsets. So that's another key issue that needs to be reformed. And this probably is the key slide, I think, in this presentation, but it's one that actually brings together the supply and the demand side. So we can see from the demand side that they want to have these additional attributes to give buyers more choice. And you can see from the potential supply side from this quote here, we also have a wide range of different attributes: effectiveness, duration, cost, scalability. And that seemed to me to be the key way that we could then actually reform the market and bring together what the market wants in terms of the supply of credits, in terms of the demand for credits, and how the supply could then sort of merge together. And we have been pushing that the key attributes that we really need then for CDR to partner with emissions reduction are long duration, safe, verifiable, and scalable methods. Those would probably be the four attributes that we've been pushing forward, because that will deliver the sort of carbon dioxide removal that we really need to be sure that it is going to play a role to keep temperatures to 2 Celsius or less. And again, what we've tried to do in terms of a fit for purpose market is to try and come up with incentives that will actually have the market focus on CDR that's durable, safe, verifiable, and scalable. So the next problem we come to is another legacy of the dominance of avoidance credits is that we have a market metric that simply goes on tons of carbon. And that's fine for avoidance. You avoid 1 ton of deforestation, you avoid 1 ton of land clearing. Yeah, you can work with that metric in the market. But how do you use tons of carbon when one method could sequester carbon for 10 years or for 100 or permanently? How do you then bring that into play for the market? Because that's another key issue. And it also means that there's no incentives to go for perhaps a more expensive but long duration carbon dioxide removal method. And so the key message that we came out with our comment was pricing offsets according to how much carbon is removed, for how long, how reliably, with direct funding to the most effective climate solutions. So it's all very well and good to say this, but how do we actually then incentivize this? Well, here are our solutions. We know from people or initiatives that have tried to come up with carbon taxes that markets do not like complex or intricate metrics. So we've come up with a more approachable two-step solution. The first one is to change the standard from a carbon ton to a carbon ton year. This means that if you have methods such as some of these chemical methods that have much longer sequestration times, they get rewarded for storing that carbon for longer. In contrast, some other methods that have an ecological basis would be funded less. And so it's a key way to put incentives out there for long duration by going to carbon ton year. And we want to then also couple that with a warranty. So we have a warranty where the seller of the offsets then has to vouch for the method's reliability and also its safety. So that brings in issues where you have to actually be able to sort of demonstrate that the duration of this carbon dioxide removal will be 100 years or 50 years or something less. What we're also proposing is that the scale of the warranty would be directly related to the size of the uncertainty envelope, because what that will do is it'll actually promote ways in which you want to reduce the warranty. As a seller, you don't want to be carrying a large warranty because you have poor verification or you don't really understand the risks and the side effects. So again, this would incentivize safe and verifiable long duration carbon dioxide removal. And so probably the weak point in the article then was then really how we'd start to develop the market, how would we actually do the bookkeeping, because of course we put in here that, you know, some methods that are more difficult to verify may be overly optimistic about their delivery. So there are a number of issues to be tackled in the market. And we were delighted to be contacted a few weeks after we put our article out by a team of 3 authors who had published something in the Harvard Business Review, which actually then talked about some of these issues. You can see here, did not perform as promised, you know, chimes with what we said about overly optimistic delivery. And in their article, they then come up with this very novel sort of version of double book accounting, where they provide, as I say, a foundation for a well-functioning market that accelerates innovation and deployment. So we've been in discussion with Karthik and Mark and Robert to talk about this further. So that's been a useful stepping stone from our comment. And so just to summarize it and then to pose a question. So we have 4 different challenges to tackle. We need to look at the technology development time, and here you can see this is the marine plastic scale bar, a projected one for CO2 removal. We need to boost the amount of offsets. These are some of these increases, again, coming from the task force report. Set realistic offset prices, which I've talked about earlier, which is the legacy of just relying on avoidance. And then by going from a carbon ton to a carbon ton year with a warranty, bringing in different storage times. But of course, the key issue is, you know, when the rubber hits the road is, will companies actually pay for high quality carbon removal offsets? And so rather than just leave that hanging at the end of the talk, here's a couple of additional slides. So the first thing is that some of the ideas in our comment pieces are already being picked up by policy people. This is from the UK greenhouse gas sort of removal hub. So they're talking about the spectrum of costs here. But the other thing we picked up from the report was that the Boston Consulting Group, after consulting with around about 500 buyers of offsets, actually suggests that there is a willingness to purchase removal credits with high impact scores. So we went to this report that came out last September, and here we can see very useful information from around 500 companies. Buyers seek dimensions of quality that will help them defend their purchase decisions in the face of heightened stakeholder scrutiny, and about the need to improve the quality of credits. And I'm going to leave you with this last slide, which I think is an incredibly useful sort of survey. Here we can see, when we look across these here, the key aspects that people are rated most highly were MRB, project transparency, but also things like permanence, additionality, and co-benefits. So there's a lot to unpack in this slide. You can see it's from nearly 500 companies, but I think this is a useful step in the right direction, and certainly an indication that we're not coming up with some pie in the sky ideas about market reforms. And I'll leave it there. Thanks, Will.
All right. Okay, thanks, Phil. As I said, I'm gonna just ask a couple of things that I'm curious about, and then we will move to audience questions. So again, continue to populate the Q&A box, and we'll get to them. One of your core messages is that most credits in the voluntary carbon market, right, are offsets related to avoided deforestation. And you said, quote, these offsets do little to lower CO2 levels in the air and should be replaced with those that facilitate proper removal. Let me play devil's advocate for a moment, okay? Yeah, couldn't the argument be made that avoided deforestation avoids emissions, right, that would otherwise occur, and these emissions could ultimately, in the next couple of decades, push us over critical climatic thresholds, and so avoiding those kind of emissions is equally valuable as removing carbon from the atmosphere, and hence we shouldn't be of denying the worth of that approach. What do you think?
Yes, I mean, avoidance, as I said earlier, won't exacerbate. Avoidance offsets help us not exacerbate CO2 emissions issue. But at the same time, I think I mentioned that the key issue, I think, is the one of scale. If we have to participate at the sort of billion-ton level of carbon dioxide removal, then there's only so much more avoided deforestation or land clearing we can do. So certainly it could still play a role. It still could be part of the market, but I think that 3 IPCC reports are telling us that we need both the pull and push of emissions reduction along with then carbon dioxide removal. We've actually left it too late, and those rates of decarbonisation of 18% per year are just frighteningly high. So yes, I think to respond, we don't have to necessarily slam the door on avoidance offsets, but certainly they might have to be taken off into a separate market, because of course, if we move towards a carbon ton year metric, we can't really use that to handle avoidance. So they could be calved off into a separate market. But I think then clearly the message from the task force was we need to transition if we're going to grow by 15-fold by 2030 and 50-fold by 2050. We have to transition to removal. That's the only way we can meet that demand.
Okay, thanks. So you also indicate in the piece that quote regulators, close quote, should rate the quality of offsets. I'm curious if you have any strong thoughts about whether that regulation should happen at the international level, maybe to ensure some kind of uniformity of approaches, or does it make more sense to be done at the national level, reflecting individual differences, maybe in the approaches and things of that nature? Where do you think this should lie? Does it matter?
It's a thorny question, and I think we can actually learn from the emissions reduction community. So of course, at the minute, every nation has the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, which were part of the COP. And they're faced with big tasks in terms of interoperability, actually stitching together a quilt to actually do a grand global accounting of all the cumulative effect of the NDCs. And so one of the things that we did talk about in the article was the ability to do monitoring, reporting, and verification, and probably having some sort of independent body. And we used some examples where we now have pretty amazing resolution down to the hectare scale for carbon satellites to look at vegetation, and that's been part of the reason we've seen some exposés on, as you mentioned earlier, on the terrestrial forests, the red plus ones. then the other example we gave in the paper then was using a tried and tested means of sort of robotic instruments in the ocean, and we actually came up with a potential budget that would allow that to happen. As far as I'm aware, there was some discussion about that at the G7 meeting in Japan late last year, because the international body called Argo, who look after these robotic profilers, has a connection into the G7, which is particularly useful. So we use that as a sort of a tractable example of how individual nations could come together and do, in this case, global observing of the ocean, which would develop monitoring, reporting, and verification. And this group has been very successful. It has 40 nations involved in the Argo program, and they just have two simple rules: open access and interoperability. And that is taking them a long way. So I think there are a few useful examples out there, but of course, there's always that thorny issue between national interests and international sort of viewpoints that has to be stepped through. But I think what we tried to do in the article was to come up with a couple of points of departure where we might get something, rather than just, as scientists typically do, leave things hanging.
Right. Yeah, I thought that those examples were particularly salient, right? And I think in the long term, trying to rely on the capabilities of, small startup companies, right, is neither realistic or probably totally fair to them, right? And drawing upon some of the international resources we already have seems really helpful. And I'd encourage people to look at the article in terms of your discussion of how we might learn from other treaty regimes, right? Things that would be helpful in terms
Yeah,
of developing
yeah,
those standards, right? It's
yeah.
go
Because
ahead,
I
Phil.
think the other issue, in the same way we want to incentivize the market to move towards durable, safe, verifiable CDR, we also want to incentivize reportage and participation by different companies and startups. And so if we can get this funded across a bunch of nations and then put it out as a free product, I think that's a way then to say, okay, we can reduce your bottom line. You don't have to look out for MRV. This one will be accredited. Come and work with us this way. I think that's the way to go. So
Yeah, I thought that was a good quid pro quo that I think a lot of companies might entertain. So, all right, I'm going to ask one last question and then we'll get to audience questions. So you have a section where you advocate for what you call warranties, right? Which included, you said, potential risks associated with CDR approaches, as well as uh, uh, issues associated with levels of sequestration. But one of the risks that you pointed out for one approach leapt out to me, and I just wanted to tease that out a little with you. So that was BECCS, right? Bioenergy,
yeah,
carbon capture and storage. And you indicated that one of the risks, which obviously is true, of large scale BECCS deployment would be raising food prices, right? If we diverted large amounts of agricultural land for dedicated energy crops, right? For the bioenergy side. But I'm wondering, in the real world, how would that work? Let's say, for example, you have an individual BECCS company, right? And they're deploying, and food prices go up in the world, right? How is that individual company on the hook, because it's only the cumulative impacts, right, that would cause the food price increases, probably not a discrete project, but are they individually liable, and how would you allocate that kind of liability under a warranties approach?
yeah. No, that's a thorny question. The reason we use that example was, again, that there is evidence in the fledgling biofuels market of probably 15 to 20 years ago. If you recall, because of the dedicating too much land to biofuels, we ended up with food riots in a number of countries. They were running out of corn to make tortillas in Mexico, and global commodities like milk went through the roof. So while you could really make one individual company culpable for that, certainly you could see alarm bells ringing with just that shift in agricultural practice in terms of the market. So in terms of detecting it, you could certainly pick up on it. How you would deal with that, again, yeah, I think that's a very hard-hitting question. But again, we tried to base everything we put in there on things that have actually happened in the real world. But yeah, I don't have an answer about how you would actually divest the sort of responsibility for that to a bunch of players, because as you say, it's a cumulative effect.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's going to be causality questions too, right? Because there's some studies that say maybe 15-20% of that spike in food prices was related to, Europe's increase in bioenergy buying, and it was other
Yep.
factors, right? Right. Yeah. It's the kind of thing that makes people like me in the law happy, though, because it gives us lots of billable hours to
Yeah.
consider it. So yeah, I think it's
I mean,
interesting.
just to finish on side effects, perhaps a better example might be some particular method where you're removing carbon dioxide, but you might have a side effect where you're releasing something like methane, which is an
Hmm.
even more potent greenhouse gas. But what is the, so it's baking things like that into the warranty where you say, hang on a second, we're going to have to devalue your carbon ton year because you do have this small but significant release of methane. So there's a few other things there that could be probably more readily assessed. But yeah, the food example, as you say, is plugged into and inextricably linked to many things. So yeah, that's a thorny one.
All right, so let's get on to some audience questions. First one, what is your opinion of Frontier's advanced market commitment and the growing number of technologies being recognized as viable for offsets on voluntary markets? Is it worsening an existing problem or a key boost for CDR tech and market development?
Yes, in the article we did actually touch upon the advanced purchase option, which has actually worked quite well for the development of vaccines. But so something like the advanced purchase option from Frontiers, or the other one which is called the blended ton option, where you take a fast starting and a slow burning two different CDR methods. That could be a way to address this mismatch that I mentioned in the first part of my talk, where we need the voluntary markets to help drive down cost curves, but at the same time, the voluntary markets need to satisfy the demand for credits. So advanced purchase options can help that in a little bit of way, or the blended carbon approach. But again, the issue is one of scale, because obviously when you're paying, I think Frontier were paying $200 to $300 a ton sort of commitment. That's obviously their loss leader, but how long can you run that loss leader for if we're going to move to sort of 1 billion tons, given that the current price at the minute is, as I mentioned, is much less. So certainly there are some issues, but yeah, that's probably been one of the more creative solutions out there. But again, the thing that's going to get us every time is just the sheer eye-watering scale that we have to spin this up to, this 1 billion ton challenge. And again, just for people to get their head around 1 billion tons, it's about the same sort of scale as global food production, or the same scale as global cement production. So when you look at the infrastructure, the subsidies, and everything else that drives food production on the planet, it definitely gives you a little bit of an eye water in terms of what's involved. So
Yeah, a daunting task indeed. All right, next question. This goes back to this idea of warranties, right? The question is, you mentioned a seller's warranty. Do you see carbon insurance playing a role in reducing the risks for both supply and demand?
yeah, well, I mean, again, we tried to choose something like a warranty because it's used in business. There are business models associated with it, and I would imagine as this grows, then you could see an insurance, possibly even a reinsurance sort of secondary market sort of growing into it. So yeah, given how large this is going to scale, I think, if we're talking 1 billion, and that article in The Economist, potentially even a 1 trillion ton industry, then it will have to come with the commensurate sort of checks and balances. So yeah, I mean, if there's going to be the article in the Harvard Business Review talked about the potential for carbon fraud. We've
Hmm.
seen a little bit from the Guardian Der Spiegel investigation of forestry. So
Yeah,
yes,
arguably a lot.
yes, yes. So I would imagine, yeah, building in some checks and balances and being able to take some insurance out, and it might be a way to move this forward as well.
All right. Next question. This is related how to finance an oversight body, right? And the question is, the existing standard setters are generally subject to the same quality degrading incentives that undercut some other environmental compliance enforcement mechanisms, such as zoning and building permits, floodplain development, et cetera. The need for volumes of transactions to drive revenue is corrosive. Do you have any ideas how to fund oversight bodies in order to avoid the race to the bottom problem that haunts so much of the broader field?
Yes, I mean the one example again we gave was this one of monitoring, reporting, and verification using this international body that exists already. And what we said was that a proportion of the funding would be actually set aside to come up with this independent body, certainly on the MRV space, because of course at the minute you can't actually get a baseline because we're living in the Anthropocene. So how do you actually work out what the baseline is? And we know that baselines have caused all sorts of problems again with that forestry investigation when there was actually a active logging going on the control side, which was doing all sorts of things to the carbon accounting. So by setting up again some sort of independent body to do MRV, and again setting that up as a free service to actually then get some compliance from companies, we see that as a sort of a sort of step forward. But again, as the person posed the question has sort of alluded to, yeah, there are a bunch of other good examples out there about how not to do this, and perhaps again we can learn from them. As I mentioned earlier, I think we've got about the next sort of five or so years to sort of get this right. So the sooner we start talking about this and using real world examples to keep it real, the better.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Next question. What do you actually wish to be traded in quote operational close quote terms? For forest carbon measure with LiDAR is feasible, yearly, cost effective. The major question is how does the 1 year asset compare to a permanent carbon removal, such as more than 10,000 years? I think it's a question of how it looks logistically, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, there is a problem that we allude to in the article that if you're going to claim that something will be stored for 1,000 years, you can't really verify that because it's kind of an intergenerational problem, right? So it has to come from modeling, and the key point I think there is that for some of these methods, some of the chemical methods, they are grounded on uh, some fundamental sort of bedrock that we understand really well, you know, and so we can actually then use that to put some certainty into things. Some of the other approaches that are biological, there's not really even any underpinning theory for some of these things. So again, you have that greater risk. But yeah, it's going to have to rely on modeling. And again, the idea with the warranty was to scale it to the size of the uncertainty envelope. And so again, that was to provide incentives to actually reduce the warranty by coming up with better models, by coming up with better risk assessment of side effects. But yes, so that there is an issue. But of course, I think with some of the chemical methods, you can almost remove things permanently, which also raises an issue. How do you reward someone for a permanent removal if you're using the carbon ton year? So, yeah, there's a few things like that that we've thought about, but we don't have an answer just yet. I mean, it might be that you nominally for something permanent, you get a 1,000 year, you get 1,000 carbon ton years, something like that. So, but again, I think important things to discuss, and these questions are very rich in terms of where we need to move this in the coming years.
Okay. All right. Next question. Says, apologies if I missed this, but how would you envision the warranty working? Would it include some mechanism to deal with anticipated re-release of carbon dioxide? That's been a major issue in the forestry sector, and the most common way of addressing it, such as through buffer pools, looks to increasingly ineffective and problematic. What does it look like in the real world?
Well, I mean, I think having something like a carbon ton year is the way to move on this, because obviously it may be that after 10 years you have to reappraise your initial estimate on the expected duration of some of these credits. But having a carbon ton year gives you a way to do that. Such if you're having re-release, then you that's when the warranty will come in, because it actually then looks after put re-release under side effects or risk. So by coupling the carbon ton year with the warranty, all the complexities and the nuances go into the warranty, and we keep the metric clean and very simple. Carbon ton year, the markets will get that. So it's that sort of truck and trailer approach where you have this complex product, but the warranty is doing most of the heavy lifting with respect to complexity or revaluing the carbon ton year duration.
Well, people are hot for this warranty question, so I have another one in that context for you. Regarding the warranty idea, instituting a warranty implies that companies would be wanting to stick around a while, develop and maintain their good reputation. What else would be needed along with a warranty system to prevent, quote, flash in the pan, close quote, companies to sell a bunch of unreliable credits, then disappear through bankruptcy and just shady dealing, leaving the purchaser unprotected by the warranty system?
Well, maybe we can answer that in part by referring to the earlier question about the sort of insurance policy. That might be a way to deal with that. But the other issue then is that if you have some sort of flash in the pan company, if they're not putting out a product which is durable, safe, and verifiable, then they're not going to get much return on their carbon ton year, and they're going to be carrying a pretty big warranty. So that may push some of that away, because of course when it comes to the carbon ton year, the company itself doesn't decide how much it can be. That has to be done independently. So I think that there are a few checks and balances, but the idea is by pushing things towards durable, safe, verifiable, scalable methods, then we kind of get rid of some of the cowboy element.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But as I say, that's in an ideal world. Of course, if you've got an industry that's fledgling, that's touted to grow to billions or even $1 trillion, yeah, of course, you're going to get a diverse range of approaches, shall we say. And there's nothing we can really do about that, but we just would hope that by incentivizing these safe, verifiable, durable things, then that would sort of sort things out by providing a bigger financial reward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the insurance industry would help sniff out some of the flash in the pan also, right, through their due diligence, right? So probably the
Yeah.
more eyes, the better. So okay, next question. Because of the rate of CO2 dissolution in seawater, should offshore CCS liabilities be governmental rather than corporate liability?
CCS is an interesting one. It got quite the going over at the COP just recently.
Yeah.
And so one of our concerns about that was that suddenly it would be conflated with CDR, because at the minute CCS is synonymous with oil and gas. CDR is not, and so my hope is that we don't run into that problem. But at the minute we're really focusing on CDR rather than CCS.
Hmm.
So I don't think that it's worth taking that question further at this point. But I kind of get the sentiment they're coming with.
Yeah, and it could still be pertinent, right, in the context of anything that has a conveyance of CO2, right, and storage,
Yeah.
right, and BECS, right, direct air capture, right.
Mhm, yes. Yes. And things like that. But again, there's some interesting issues with respect to the ocean and whether with it being uh, the global commons and things like that. So there are some issues there about whether governments or regions have to step into this rather than companies. So no, I do take the point they were making, but at the minute. We've actually got a meeting coming up in Australia in a couple of months' time just to talk about terminology because different government departments are using different terms, and it's time to try and sort that out. So rather than talk anymore about CCS now, I'll just stick to CVR just to keep it simple.
Hmm. Well, related to that is a question that asks, how do you exactly define carbon removal? Is it similar to the draft EU regulation? Do you have a working
Uh,
definition in any of the work here?
yeah, I mean, again, this comes back to the need for a unified terminology, and which also brings with it the right sort of definition. But I think groups like Carbon 180 have done a pretty good job with respect to defining carbon dioxide removal in terms of the global carbon cycle. So I think that would be the surest footing. I haven't seen the current draft EU one, but clearly we all have to be on the same page when it comes to these definitions.
Next question. If the carbon ton per years must be modeled with variable uncertainty envelopes, can markets really achieve liquidity, which seems necessary for insurance and warranty uh, concepts to work?
Well, again, I think by having the truck and trailer approach of the carbon ton year, but linked to the warranty, gives you a very powerful, quite complex metric, but still one where the market's just trading on the carbon ton year, but it's the size of the warranty that would capture the cumulative uncertainties from modeling or from the underpinning scientific principles, as I mentioned earlier, chemical sequestration. It's definitely on a much firmer footing than anything that's biological because of the inherent complexity that biology can bring to things with respect to unanticipated side effects or even anticipated side effects. So again, by baking these into a warranty and then coupling it with the carbon ton year, I think it gives us something that's quite versatile.
Yeah. All right. So here's a question for an ocean guy like you. What about the ocean carbon cycle, whereby shorter duration tons get re-removed?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, that's by having a carbon ton year, you build in the different incentives there. So you obviously don't want to go for something that's in the short carbon cycle where possible. You want something in the longer carbon cycle.
All right, so let's stay on the ocean theme. What are your thoughts on the centennial carbon ton that the Exodus Ocean Iron team is advocating? Right, our folks at Woods Hole, right, working on ocean iron fertilization.
Yeah, no, I was pleased to see it. I think that came out of their meeting in Monterey last year. But again, it's sort of moving along the same sort of lines as a carbon ton year. So sort of trying to just move beyond the idea of a carbon ton, which, as I mentioned earlier, I think is a legacy of the dominance of avoidance offsets in the market. So yeah, I think anything, as I say, also carbon 180 has been talking about carbon ton years in the context of the sort of global carbon cycle. So there are a few people starting to bring some element of time into how you'd assess it. So yeah, that's a step in the right direction.
Okay. Let's see. what else I've got in here. There's a question, is there a warranty for methane removal? And I think
Well,
they're
again,
referring to the other approach, right, to address greenhouse gas removal, right, that we're focusing on now.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, again, I think the approach of the ton year concept with the warranty could be applied to any other greenhouse and any other gas with greenhouse warming potential. But as I say, it's a case of trying to start a discussion now about moving the markets to the right sort of place. But yeah, I think I can see very readily that methane could be accommodated in a similar sort of framework.
Okay. Um, is the carbon ton year just carbon, or is it greenhouse gas equivalent?
Again, I think the most important thing is linking a metric with a warranty to give us the simplicity that the markets demand, with the complexity and the checks and balances we need to make sure that it actually can function, that the metric can function. So whether it was carbon or methane or some other gas with greenhouse warming potential, I think they all could be accommodated. You might want to, for accounting purposes, to run them as slightly separately, or it could eventually become a greenhouse gas ton year.
Let's see. Let's see what else we might have in here. Um, Actually, I think we've worked through most of the substantive questions. So I guess the last thing I'd invite you to do, Phil, is maybe tell us where you think this work should go from this point. What do you think are some of the things that need to be most fleshed out, perhaps in terms of those four categories you're talking about, and how might that happen?
Yeah, what concerns me particularly is this mismatch between the projected demand and supply, because I see that as a place where fraudulent practices start to be sort of pushed through. Um, what I did try and show at the end of my presentation was that, again, with the work being done by the group on the double book carbon accounting, I think that's a really step forward. The Boston security guys actually getting some useful granular information about what almost 500 buyers of offsets actually value most.
Right.
I think are good steps in the right direction. So that's encouraging. I still think the elephant in the room is this mismatch, because, as I've indicated, I think it'll take at least a decade for any of these things to spin up to where the point where they're tried and tested, where they can be upscaled with confidence. And I'm not sure where the funding is going to come for that. As I mentioned, the advanced purchase option, I think, is a good idea. It's worked well with the development of vaccines, but given the sheer scale of this billion-dollar challenge, can it continue to be a loss leader? So I think that needs some careful thought. But I think that's really the key issue for now. The concept of the blended ton that I mentioned earlier, where you couple something that's almost ready to go, but with a short duration with something of long duration. I think that's got a few issues that need to be ironed out. But that for me is really the biggest impediment to moving these sort of ideas along.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, it's certainly when you looked at the discussion in the Paris Agreement, right, of the 6.4 supervisory body, right, there was certainly a lot more granular discussion about accounting, right, for nature-based solutions and CDR in general, right, than we've ever seen in an international institutional context, right? So I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
that probably bodes well too, right? That we've kind of moved on to that next stage, right? Beyond, just notional concepts of carbon removal, right? Which
yeah,
also,
yeah.
right, has to be done quickly. So that's great. All right, the clock has hit the top, and we are ready to conclude. Once again, I want to thank Philip Boyd for a really thoughtful article, along with his co-authors, and some thoughtful discussion here, and some great questions from our audience. Thank you, everyone. We hope to see you again in a couple of weeks. Stay tuned to see what we have for February in Scrubbing the Skies. And with that, I will say goodbye, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Bye.